It didn't arrive with fanfare. There were no lights across the sky, no broadcast interruption, no alien craft visible on any telescope feed. The first confirmed contact between humanity and an extraterrestrial civilization came through a standard relay node positioned at the L4 Lagrange point of Jupiter, a logistics buoy essentially installed to support mineral survey teams working the asteroid belt. At 3:17 Universal Time Coordinated on a Tuesday, the node received a compressed data packet on a frequency that human engineers had deliberately left open as part of a passive SETI protocol ratified 20 years earlier. Nobody expected anything to come of it. Most people had forgotten the protocol existed. Dr. Yumiko Sato, Senior Communications Analyst at the Outer Systems Monitoring Center in Reykjavik, was the first human to recognize what she was looking at. She later described the moment with careful restraint, the way scientists tend to do when the magnitude of a discovery has not yet resolved into something they can fully process. The encoding was layered, she told the UN Science Council in her formal deposition. It used prime-based mathematical foundations at the first layer, the kind of thing you'd expect from a civilization trying to establish shared logic. But the second layer was already in modified standard Mandarin and English. They had been listening to us long enough to learn our languages. That was the detail that stopped me. The message had been in transit for approximately 11 months, originating from a point source consistent with a location near the star designated Gliese 667c, roughly 23.6 light-years from Earth. The Galactic Council, as the senders identified themselves, represented a coalition of 41 spacefaring civilizations, organized across a loose administrative structure that had governed the Orion Arms inhabited systems for what they claimed was over 4,000 years. The opening lines of the message were formal to the point of sterility. A declaration of existence. A summary of the Council's authority and jurisdiction. A geographical mapping of Council space, which encompassed a volume so large that Earth's entire solar system sat comfortably within its theoretical outer boundary. That last detail was not framed as a threat. It didn't need to be. They had been listening to us long enough to learn our languages. That was the detail that stopped me. Dr. Yumiko Sato, UN Science Council Deposition Year 1. The message was classified at the highest level within 6 hours of its verification. For the next 9 days, a working group of 47 specialists, linguists, military strategists, astrophysicists, diplomatic historians, and 3 former heads of state, worked inside a sealed facility beneath the European Space Agency's operations wing in Darmstadt. They translated every layer of the document with methodical care, cross-checking idioms and checking for ambiguity in phrasing that might have diplomatic significance. What they found, at its core, was a document that was trying very hard to sound like an invitation while being structured, unmistakably, as a summons. The Council had noted Earth's growing technological activity, particularly the acceleration of fusion-drive spacecraft and the establishment of permanent habitats beyond Mars. In their framework, a civilization that could sustain life beyond its origin planet had crossed a threshold they called jurisdictional relevance. It was, in essence, a legal designation. Earth had become, in the Council's administrative language, a registered developing world, and as such, was now subject to the Council's Charter of Civilizational Governance. The message did not ask whether humanity consented to this classification. It informed them of it. The discovery was made public 22 days after Dr. Sato's initial identification, following a coordinated release managed by the UN Secretary-General's office in collaboration with the 5 Permanent Security Council members. The announcement was, by any measure, the most watched live event in human history. But what the public received was a carefully edited summary. The full text of the Council's message, including its specific demands, was withheld from public release for another 4 months, pending what officials described as ongoing strategic review. What they were actually doing was arguing. Not about whether the message was real or whether it was a threat. They were arguing about something that, in retrospect, was the only question that ever truly mattered: whether humanity as a species had the right, and the capacity, to say no. The debate inside that facility in Darmstadt lasted 11 days. It was not resolved by consensus. It was resolved by a decision made by 4 people in a room with no recording equipment, no official transcript, and no public mandate. What came out of that room would, within the following year, alter the trajectory of every human life on Earth and beyond it. The Galactic Council had extended what it considered a routine administrative contact. They had done this 47 times before with other species. In 39 of those cases, the contacted civilization had complied within 60 days. In the remaining 8, Compliance had eventually followed after a period of what the Council's internal records called adjustment. They had not yet encountered a civilization that responded the way Earth did. But that was still months away. First, humanity had to understand exactly what it was being asked to give up. He documented that Earth's working group spent 9 days translating ran to approximately 14,000 words in its original encoding, dense, hierarchical, and written in the bureaucratic idiom of a civilization that had been drafting interstellar policy for longer than Rome had existed. Stripped of its procedural language, however, its requirements were not complicated. They were simply, in the estimation of every strategic analyst who reviewed them, unacceptable. The Council's Charter of Civilizational Governance operated on a principle its drafters called structured integration. A newly registered developing world, Earth in this case, would be permitted to continue its technological development and maintain self-governance over its internal affairs. Elections, economies, cultural institutions, all preserved. What the Council required in exchange was something that sounded, at first reading, almost reasonable. A seat at the table. A voice in the decision-making body. Formal membership. The language was careful, even generous. It was only when the analysts read the specific provisions of that membership that the shape of the thing became clear. Article 14 of the Charter, colloquially named the Defense Integration Clause by the Darmstadt Group, required that any member civilization submit its military assets to a Council-administered readiness review every 30 years. The review itself was not coercive. Member worlds retained their armed forces. But the review's findings would be binding on deployment decisions involving assets above a certain destructive threshold. In practice, this meant that Earth's nuclear arsenal, its long-range deep space weapons platforms, and any future weapon systems that met the Council's destructive threshold would require Council authorization before deployment, even in defense of Earth's own territory, if that territory fell within what the Charter defined as a stabilization zone. It was not a cage. It was a leash. A long one, well padded, designed so that the animal wearing it might never feel the tension, until it tried to run. Working Group Internal Memorandum Darmstadt, Day 6. Article 22 was simpler and, in some ways, more troubling. It required that any developing world grant Council observers permanent access to its primary communication infrastructure, framed as a transparency measure designed to prevent destabilizing unilateral action. The Council would not, the Charter stressed, interfere in the content of human communications. They would only monitor for activity that triggered their automated threat classification protocols. The distinction between monitoring and surveillance was, the working group noted acidly, apparently considered meaningful by whoever drafted the document. Article 31 addressed economic integration. Member worlds were expected to participate in a Council-administered resource exchange framework, trading processed rare earth materials, biological intellectual property, specifically pharmaceutical and agricultural innovations, and data access in exchange for what the Charter described as developmental support and navigational privileges. The exchange rates were fixed by the Council. There was no negotiation mechanism outlined in the document. Earth would be paid what the Council decided Earth was worth, for goods the Council decided it wanted. There were benefits, and the analysts were scrupulous about acknowledging them. The Council offered something called a Civilizational Shield Compact, a mutual defense guarantee under which member worlds could call on Council military assets in the event of an external threat. Given that humanity had no meaningful idea what external threats existed in the broader galaxy, this was not nothing. It was, depending on your perspective, either the most valuable thing in the document or the most sophisticated sales pitch in the history of diplomacy. You would be protected. You would simply not be entirely in control of your own weapons, your own communications, or your own economic terms. The working group's final summary characterized the Charter as a framework designed for civilizations that had no viable alternative to compliance. That assessment was precise. The Council had refined this document across 47 first contacts. It was structured, deliberately, so that its terms were slightly better than what a developing world could reasonably expect from a 41-civilization coalition with a 4,000-year head start on military technology. The calculation was almost elegant. Make the terms livable, make the cost of refusal seem catastrophic, and the math would do the rest. What the Council had not calculated was the possibility that humanity's decision-makers would look at the math and conclude, with clear eyes and no illusions about the odds, that the cost of refusal was still preferable to the alternative. That conclusion did not emerge from bravado. It emerged from a specific strategic assessment, conducted by 4 people who understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what they were choosing between. The process by which Earth arrived at its response is as important as the response itself. It is worth understanding precisely how that decision was made, and by whom. Four people in the unrecorded room were Admiral Chen Wei of the UN Combined Defense Directorate, Secretary General Amara Osei, Dr. Fatima al-Rashid, the astrophysicist who had led the working group's technical analysis, and a man identified in the partial record that eventually became public only as the advisor, whose institutional affiliation remains classified to this day. What is known is that the meeting lasted approximately 6 hours and that its outcome was not unanimous. 3 of the 4 agreed. The 4th signed off, reluctantly, on the grounds that a split decision would be more dangerous than a united one. The strategic case for refusal rested on 4 pillars. Admiral Chen had constructed them across the 9 days of the working group's analysis, building a framework that was, by his own admission, uncomfortable to defend and probably correct. The first pillar was temporal. The Council's message had traveled 23.6 light-years. Any response Earth sent would take the same duration to arrive. Any military consequence that followed would add another 23-odd years of travel time. Earth had, at minimum, 47 years of lead time between its response and any physical consequence, and that was assuming the Council responded immediately, which, given its administrative structure, seemed unlikely. Time was the single resource humanity had that the Council could not remove. Compliance today does not purchase safety. It purchases the appearance of safety, which is a different thing entirely, and which becomes indistinguishable from vulnerability the moment the Council decides to reclassify its terms. Admiral Chen Wei, Darmstadt, Day 9. The second pillar was jurisdictional. The Charter's Defense Integration Clause required authorization for weapons deployment in stabilization zones. Dr. al-Rashid's technical team had cross-referenced the zone definitions with Earth's star charts. The entirety of the solar system, every planet, every moon, the asteroid belt, the Kuiper belt, the heliopause, fell within a stabilization zone boundary. This was not an oversight. It was a structural feature of the Charter, one that became visible only when you overlaid the zone maps with actual celestial geography. A civilization that signed the Charter would be required to seek Council authorization to fire a defensive weapon anywhere within its own home system. The Charter's defenders would argue, correctly, that authorization could be granted quickly in genuine emergencies. Admiral Chen's team had done the math on the Council's administrative response times, extrapolated from the document's own procedural language. Quickly, in Council terms, was measured in weeks. The third pillar was economic. Article 31's resource exchange framework, examined by the working group's 2 economists, bore a striking structural resemblance to what historians had called extraction economies, arrangements in which the terms of trade were set by the more powerful party, adjusted incrementally over time, and made progressively harder to exit as dependency deepened. The economists were careful not to overstate the parallel. The Council was not necessarily malicious. It was simply large, old, and accustomed to setting terms that served its existing members' interests. Earth, as the newest and least developed member, would be at the bottom of that priority structure indefinitely. The 4th pillar was the most contested, and it came from Secretary General Osei, who had spent the first 6 days of the working group largely listening. Her argument was not strategic. It was political in the deepest sense of the word. If humanity signed the Charter under these terms, it would be making a decision on behalf of every future generation of its species, a decision about the kind of civilization Earth would become. She did not argue that the Council was evil, or that refusal was without risk. She argued that there was a difference between joining a community of spacefaring civilizations as a partner and joining it as a client. That difference, once accepted, would shape human political identity for as long as humanity existed. We can negotiate from outside, she said, according to the partial record. We cannot renegotiate from inside. That's not cynicism. That's how governance structures work. The refusal, when it was formally drafted, was not a rejection of contact. It was not a declaration of hostility. It was a precisely worded document, 14 pages in its final form, that acknowledged receipt of the Council's Charter, expressed genuine interest in establishing formal relations, and declined membership on the specific grounds that the Charter's current terms were inconsistent with Earth's constitutional obligations to its own citizens. It proposed, in their place, a bilateral framework for dialogue without preconditions. It was, in tone, scrupulously respectful. In substance, it was a no. Drafting the response took 3 days. Encoding it for transmission took another 2. The message departed the L4 relay node on a morning that was, by most external metrics, unremarkable. The people who sent it went back to their other work and waited. They had 47 years, give or take, before anything arrived to tell them whether they had made the right call. In the meantime, they did something the council had not anticipated at all. They prepared. Earth's Refusal arrived at the council's primary relay station near Gliese 667c 23 years and 8 months after it was transmitted. By the time it landed, the council's administrative apparatus had already moved on to its 48th first contact, a silicon-based organism collective from a double-star system in the Perseus arm, and Earth had become a background item in their monitoring queue. A developing world that had gone quiet after initial contact was not unusual. Developing worlds were often quiet. They were, in the council's experience, thinking. And thinking, in the council's experience, reliably ended in compliance. The relay station's automated systems flagged Earth's message for review, categorized it as a non-standard integration response, and routed it to the Outer Arm Administrative Directorate, where it sat in a processing queue for approximately 4 months before a junior coordinator named Veltharasi, a member of one of the council's founding species, opened it during what amounted to a routine documentation shift. What Veltharasi read caused them to close the file, reopen it, read it again, and then spend the next 40 minutes staring at their workstation before finally escalating it to their supervisor. The specific phrase that produced this reaction was in the response's 14th paragraph, which addressed the Charter's jurisdictional provisions. Earth's drafting team had spent the better part of a day on that paragraph. They had considered and rejected approximately 40 different formulations before landing on the version that was transmitted. In the Council's administrative language, which Earth's team had used deliberately to ensure there was no ambiguity, the paragraph read, "Earth does not recognize the jurisdictional claims enumerated in Articles 7 through 19 of the Charter as applied to its solar system, and will defend its territorial integrity by all means available to it." 14 words. In 4,000 years of Charter administration, no developing world had ever transmitted those 14 words. The Directorate did not have a protocol for it. Council Administrative Record, Year 24 of Earth Contact. The 14 words were the last clause of that sentence. Will defend its territorial integrity by all means available to it. Was not a threat. It was a statement of policy, written in the same flat, procedural register as the Charter itself. But in that register, its meaning was precise and its implications were serious. Earth was not saying it might resist. It was saying resistance was its official, documented, deliberate posture, and had been, presumably, for the 24 years since it sent this message, during which time it had presumably been doing something with that posture. The Directorate escalated the response to the Council's Security Coordination Committee. The committee convened in emergency session, a designation that, in Council terms, meant the meeting happened within 90 days rather than the standard annual schedule. 17 senior representatives reviewed Earth's document. The debate that followed lasted 3 sessions over 2 months. Several things became apparent during that debate. First, nobody in the room had actually visited Earth's solar system. The monitoring data they had was 24 years old. Second, the Charter's procedural framework had no mechanism for handling a formal refusal, only for handling delayed compliance. Third, and most discomfiting, nobody could immediately answer the question of what Earth had been doing for the past 24 years. That last question was passed to the Council's intelligence apparatus, which dispatched a long-range passive observation probe toward Earth's solar system with considerable urgency. The probe would take 23 years to arrive. The committee, accordingly, had no immediate answers. What it had instead was a decision to make: treat Earth's refusal as a negotiating position and respond diplomatically, or treat it as a Charter violation and respond with the standard enforcement mechanism, a fleet notification, which was not an act of war but was designed, unmistakably, to look like one. The fleet notification had been used 8 times in Council history. It had worked all 8 times. The committee, after 2 months of deliberation, voted 23-7 in favor of the notification. The 7 who voted against it did so on a procedural objection. They wanted to see current intelligence on Earth before committing to a posture. They were outvoted. The majority's reasoning was not unreasonable. Earth was a developing world with, at last observation, fusion drive spacecraft and no weapon systems capable of threatening a Council patrol vessel. The notification was a formality. It would clarify the situation. Earth would understand the seriousness of the Council's position. And Earth would, as 47 civilizations before it had done, reconsider. The fleet notification was transmitted 29 months after Earth's refusal arrived. It would reach Earth's solar system in 23 years and 4 months. By then, the situation it was designed to resolve would already be something different entirely. He counsels fleet notification was not a fleet. That distinction is worth establishing clearly, because the term has accumulated associations that the original document did not intend. A fleet notification was a formal communication, transmitted by an authorized military relay, that informed a non-compliant world that a council patrol formation had been designated for a presence visit, a physical demonstration of the council's reach. The patrol formation typically consisted of 3 to 6 vessels. It was not designed for combat. It was designed to be seen, to be recognized for what it represented, and to create the conditions under which compliance became the most rational available option. The formation designated for Earth's presence visit was 5 vessels, 3 light patrol ships of a class the Council called Arbiters, 1 communications vessel, and 1 administrative ship carrying 3 Council mediators authorized to receive Earth's formal notification of change status. The formation departed from a Council logistics node at the outer edge of the Orion Arm and began its transit toward Earth's solar system. The journey, at the formation's standard operational speed, would take approximately 22 years. During that transit, the formation would receive no new intelligence about Earth, because none would be available. The passive observation probe dispatched earlier had not yet arrived. The formation's commanding officer, a veteran of 4 previous presence visits, was operating on 24-year-old data and the assumption that Earth had not done anything materially significant in the interim. On Earth, that assumption was spectacularly wrong. The 47 years between the original refusal and the fleet's eventual arrival at the heliopause were the most concentrated period of strategic infrastructure development in human history. It was not panic. It was not a war footing in any conventional sense. It was something more deliberate and more difficult, a sustained, multi-generational institutional commitment, maintained across 4 different Secretary-General administrations and 8 different UN defense directorates, to solve a specific problem that most people on Earth did not know existed. We had approximately 47 years to make ourselves not worth fighting. That was not defeatist thinking. It was the most strategically sophisticated goal we had ever set ourselves as a species. Admiral Yusuf Abra, UN Combined Defense Directorate, Year 43. The problem was elegant in its cruelty. Earth could not, in 47 years, build a military capable of defeating a 41 civilization coalition with a 4,000-year technological advantage. That was not a realistic objective. The realistic objective, the one that Admiral Chen had outlined in the unrecorded room 20 years earlier, was to make Earth's solar system a problem whose solution cost the Council more than its value justified. Not unassailable. Not invincible. Simply expensive in the specific currency that matters to large bureaucratic organizations: political capital, material resources, and the unpredictable complications of a military engagement with an opponent who had been thinking about exactly this scenario for nearly half a century. What Earth built was not a fleet in the sense the Council would have recognized. It was a doctrine. The hardware mattered: new deep space platforms, improved kinetic systems, distributed sensor arrays that turned the entire solar system into an early warning network, but the hardware was secondary to the strategic logic underlying it. Earth's military architects had spent decades studying the Council's previous 8 presence visits, reconstructing them from linguistic analysis of the Charter's enforcement provisions and from the observable political histories of civilizations that had complied. They developed a detailed model of how presence visits worked, what they were designed to achieve, and where their assumptions were likely to fail when applied to an opponent who knew what to expect. The Council's formation crossed the heliopause of Earth's solar system on a date that, by Earth's calendar, fell in late autumn of the year designated Year 47 of contact. At the heliopause, it was met by something that none of its 5 crews had been briefed to expect: a formal communication from Earth's Defense Directorate, transmitted on the Council's own military frequency band, which the Council's intelligence apparatus had apparently not realized Earth had decoded. The communication was polite. It acknowledged the formation's arrival. It invited the formation's commanding officer to a scheduled dialogue at a proposed neutral point, a specific coordinate between Jupiter and Saturn. And it noted, without elaboration, that Earth was aware of the formation's composition and transit parameters, which was a delicate way of informing the Council that its vessels had been tracked for the last 8 years of their approach. The formation's commanding officer spent 3 hours composing a response. Then they spent another 2 hours, according to the ship's log, not sending it. The hesitation was instinctive and professionally appropriate. Something had changed in this solar system that the briefing documents had not prepared them for. The question was how much had changed, and whether the Presence Visit standard protocol was still the right tool for what they were now looking at. It was not a question the commanding officer could answer from where they were sitting. It required eyes in the system. It required updated intelligence. What it absolutely required was time, and that, the officer reflected, was something Earth had apparently been banking for a very long while. He counsels formation held position at the heliopause for 37 days. In the operational doctrine of presence visits, a holding pattern of this duration had no precedent. The standard protocol called for the formation to proceed directly to the target planet's orbit, establish communication and present the compliance deadline. 3 previous visits had encountered resistance at the planetary level, atmosphere-capable defense platforms, active scanning, even one incident of a single atmospheric fighter challenging the formation's approach. In all 3 cases, the formation had continued its approach. The visual presence of the ships, combined with the mathematical reality of the force disparity, had always resolved the situation before any weapons were fired. This was different in a way that the formation's commanding officer, Patrol Commander Irix Vale of the Tereth species, was finding difficult to communicate precisely in dispatches to the Council's Security Coordination Committee. The difference was not, she wrote carefully, the defensive system she was detecting. Earth's platforms were formidable for a developing world, but she had seen comparable installations. The difference was the architecture of how they were arranged. Every previous civilization she had encountered, and every one in the historical record, had built defensive infrastructure designed to protect specific points. The home planet, orbital stations, key mining assets. The thinking was linear: defend what matters, accept that the rest of space is the opponent's domain during any engagement. Earth's system was not built that way. It was built as a volume defense. The sensor arrays at the heliopause, the position platforms at the outer gas giants, the communications relays along 3 different orbital inclinations. All of it was designed not to stop an approaching force at a specific line, but to make the entire solar system into an engagement environment in which the approaching force would be tracked, channeled, and contested at every point from the heliopause inward. It was the defensive logic of a civilization that expected to be outgunned and had designed accordingly, not for victory in a direct confrontation, but for making the cost of that confrontation prohibitive at every step of the approach. They didn't build a wall. They built a maze. Every corridor has a way through it, and every corridor has something waiting inside it. I cannot tell my crew which corridors are trapped. Patrol Commander Irix Vale, dispatched to Security Coordination Committee, Day 12 of standoff. This assessment arrived at the committee 23 years later because that was how physics worked. In the immediate term, Irix Vale was making decisions based on her own professional judgment, with no guidance from the Council that could arrive in any useful timeframe. She was, in the most meaningful sense, alone at the edge of a solar system that had spent nearly 5 decades preparing for exactly this moment, and she knew it. The Council's entire enforcement framework had been built around the assumption of information asymmetry. The arriving force knows exactly what it is, what it can do, and what the costs of non-compliance will be. The target world knows only that something powerful has arrived. The psychological weight of that asymmetry was the mechanism by which presence visits produced compliance. It was, Irix Vale noted in her personal log, significantly less effective when the target world had been broadcasting, in precise technical language, exactly what it understood about the approaching formation for the last 8 years of its approach. Earth's Defense Directorate had been careful, during that 8-year tracking period, to share certain information and withhold other information. The transmitted tracking data showed that Earth knew the formation was coming and knew its composition. It did not, deliberately, reveal the full extent of what the sensor network could see, or what assets Earth had positioned in the outer system. The goal was not to intimidate. Intimidation required the other party to believe they were in danger, which might push them toward preemptive action. The goal was to create uncertainty, to make Irix Vale unsure whether the standard approach protocol was safe, without making her certain that it was fatal. Uncertainty, Earth strategists had concluded, was cheaper and more controllable than fear. On the 33rd day, Irix Vale accepted Earth's invitation to the proposed neutral coordinate between Jupiter and Saturn. The decision required her to move the formation through 8 years of sensor-mapped territory, which she did at minimum speed, with all non-essential systems at standby, a posture that was, in her professional estimation, both prudent and deeply uncomfortable. A patrol formation moving at minimum speed through an adversary's home system, with passive systems only, was a statement of intent as legible as any formal communication. It said, "We are not here to fight." It also said, "We are not certain we would win." The meeting at the neutral coordinate was, by all accounts of the mediators who participated in it, unlike any presence visit that had occurred before. 3 council mediators and a communications officer met, via encrypted transmission, with a delegation of 5 humans. 2 diplomats, 1 military officer, and 2 specialists whose specific roles were not clarified for the mediators. The humans were polite, technically precise, and entirely unhurried. They were, one mediator wrote later, the most relaxed people I have ever met at a negotiation. They had been waiting 47 years for this conversation. They had thought about it for longer than some of the council species' cultural memory of spaceflight. They were ready. And the council, for the first time in 4,000 years of charter administration, was not. He formation departed Earth's solar system 61 days after its arrival at the heliopause. It carried 3 things: a formal record of the neutral coordinate dialogue, a preliminary framework document that had been proposed by Earth's delegation and received, not accepted but received by the council mediators, and a dispatch from Patrol Commander Irix Vale to the Security Coordination Committee that ran to 47 pages and was classified at the highest available level upon its arrival 23 years later. The classification was eventually lifted, partially, after another 30 years. What became public confirmed most of what independent analysts had already concluded from the circumstantial evidence. The presence visit had not produced compliance. It had produced, instead, something the Council had never previously needed a word for. Earth's proposed framework was called the Bilateral Engagement Protocol. It differed from the Charter in several key respects, all of which were, from Earth's perspective, non-negotiable. Military sovereignty remained intact. No deployment authorization requirements for any weapons system within the solar system's heliopause. Communication infrastructure remained private, with transparency measures limited to a mutually agreed threat classification treaty that both sides would negotiate and ratify jointly. Economic exchange, where it occurred, would be governed by terms negotiated bilaterally rather than by Council fixed rates. In exchange, Earth offered something that it had calculated the Council would find genuinely valuable: access. Specifically, access to 47 years of independent research conducted by a civilization that had developed, in isolation, along a technological trajectory unlike any member civilization in the Council's existing knowledge base. Earth was not asking to be an equal. It was asking to be a partner. The distinction, which took the committee some years to fully appreciate, was not semantic. Partners negotiate. Clients comply. The Council had not negotiated a membership agreement in over 800 years. Veltharasi, Outer Arm Administrative Directorate, Memoir. The Council's Security Coordination Committee reviewed Irix Vale's dispatch and the preliminary framework over a period of approximately 4 years. The debate was substantive and, by the committee's standards, unusually contested. The 7 representatives who had originally voted against the fleet notification voted together again, this time in favor of engaging with Earth's framework rather than issuing a second, larger enforcement mechanism. They were joined, this time, by 9 members who had previously supported the notification. The coalition that emerged from the debate was not an ideological alignment. It was a pragmatic one. Several factors had shifted. The passive observation probe that had been dispatched years earlier had finally arrived in Earth's system and returned its first data set. What it saw was not a civilization cowering under the shadow of the Council's arrival. It saw a solar system that had, in 4 decades, established permanent human habitation on 4 additional bodies: Mars, 2 moons of Jupiter, and a modified asteroid habitat in the outer belt. It saw an industrial base that had expanded beyond anything the 24-year-old data had suggested. And it saw, in the sensor returns from Earth's defensive infrastructure, a level of technical sophistication that revised several internal assessments about the feasibility and cost of a conventional enforcement action. The probe data did not suggest that Earth was undefeatable. It suggested, precisely and uncomfortably, that the engagement would not be brief, would not be clean, and would generate the kind of prolonged complexity that large administrative coalitions were institutionally ill-suited to manage. Formal negotiations on the Bilateral Engagement Protocol began 46 years after the formation's departure from Earth's solar system. Both parties conducted them via transmission relay, which meant each exchange of documents took 47 years round trip. The process was, by any conventional measure, extraordinarily slow. It was also, paradoxically, well-suited to both parties. The Council's administrative culture was comfortable with multi-decade deliberation, and Earth had long since developed institutional structures designed to maintain policy continuity across generational transitions. The humans who began the negotiation were not the humans who finished it. But the framework held, because the logic underlying it had been documented with the kind of care that Earth's original refusal team had insisted on from the very first day. The bilateral engagement protocol was ratified in its final form, 112 years after Earth's original refusal was transmitted. It bore almost no resemblance to the Charter's standard membership terms. Earth retained full military sovereignty. It retained control of its communications infrastructure. It negotiated economic exchange rates in bilateral sessions that occurred, by mutual agreement, every 40 years. In exchange, it participated in a modified version of the Council's Civilizational Shield Compact, contributed to a joint research consortium, and accepted a permanent diplomatic mission at a Council relay station, a mission staffed by humans and operating under Earth's own institutional authority, not the Council's. It was not, by any standard definition, membership. It was something that required the Council to create an entirely new administrative category, which they did and which they named in their own language, something that translated approximately as co-standing party. Veltharasi, who had been the junior coordinator who first opened Earth's refusal all those decades ago, was by the time of ratification a senior policy architect in the Outer Arm Directorate. In a memoir published after their retirement, they offered an assessment of Earth's significance that circulated widely in Council academic circles for years afterward. The point they returned to across several chapters was not Earth's military capability or its strategic preparation. It was something quieter and, in retrospect, more important. Earth had been the first civilization in 47 contact events to read the Charter's terms carefully, understand precisely what they were agreeing to, and conclude that a better arrangement was possible if they were willing to be patient, deliberate, and uncomfortable for a very long time. They had not been reckless. They had not been arrogant. They had simply decided, with clear eyes, that the terms of integration mattered, not just for themselves, but for whatever kind of civilizational community the galaxy would eventually become. The Council had expected submission. It had received instead a proposal. And in the very long run, the distinction turned out to matter more than the Council had anticipated it would, not because of what Earth was at the moment of contact, but because of what it suggested about what Earth intended to become. A civilization that refuses on principle, negotiates on terms, and executes on strategy does not remain a developing world indefinitely. The Council had built its charter for civilizations that needed to be governed. It had encountered for the first time, one that intended to govern itself, and had the patience and the institutional memory to do it across time scales that made most of the Council's administrative machinery look rushed. That was not a comfortable lesson. But it was, most of those who studied it agreed, a necessary one. The galaxy, it turned out, was large enough for more than one kind of answer to the question of how a civilization ought to enter it. Earth had simply been the first to make that case in terms the Council could not administratively ignore. And it had done so in the only way that ever truly works, by being, quietly and methodically, entirely right.